Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 127 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In this episode, we are going to talk about how a dynamic LTN unloading station could work. Enjoy. For now, don't worry about the logistics requests. Just think about the trains. So a request will be made, and the trains will find their way here, and they turn in. This first section is the waiting area. This is because this is a dynamic station that can handle more than one train. So as a result, multiple trains might find their way to this station. So if those trains don't have anywhere to wait, they're going to be waiting on the main line, slowing everything down. So all you need to do is create little sections for the train to come in. And the trains are pretty smart, where they will try to go to the station if they can, but if they can't, they will take up one of these slots right here. And we have a very specific number of slots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 for the station itself, because I've decided that this station can handle up to 8 trains. Specifically, because it has 8 outputs, or up to 8 outputs. So the maximum that this station can handle is 8 trains, so you have to plan for the worst case scenario. So that's why we have 7 parking spaces, and the 8th for the unloading. So what happens when it comes in is the train can have any one up to 8 resources, and it doesn't matter. These inserters will just unload the train as quickly as possible into these storehouses, and they have no limitation on here. This is because they're only here as a buffer just to get the stuff off of the train as quickly as possible. And each one has a loader, so each one of these belts corresponds to one of those storehouses. So the maximum output of this train station is 8 belts. And we can calculate based on the inserters that we have 16 inserters on one side, 16 on the other. So that's 32 inserters that have a speed of 9.23. So 32 times 9.23 is 295. And 295 divided by 30 is about 9.8. So this station has a chosen output of 8 belts per second. But it can go a little faster than that, but it kind of needs to, because there isn't always going to be a train in this station that every time a train leaves, another one has to take its place. So you want the inserters to go a little faster than the expected output, and they do. So a train comes in, gets unloaded, and these resources will come down. When the train is empty, it'll just leave and go on its way, and the next one will come in, and the process will continue. But all of these belts go into the sorting warehouse. As you can see, they all just go into this guy. Now this is bigger than the other ones, solely for the fact of having lots of slots to connect things to. Now the sorting warehouse has no limitation either. It's just basically a buffer, and that's fine. This is where all the resources ultimately will go and be stored before they go on the bus, and you can decide whatever you want. And now each one of these storehouses has 2 belts going into it. Now the reason why it's 2 as opposed to 1 is it just makes it run smoother. I was testing this earlier, and it might work with 1 input belt and 1 output belt, but I did notice that it got a little full sometimes. So you just get better performance by having more output belts than input belts here. So despite the fact each one of these has 2 belts going into it, it's really limited by these 8 going in. And then you use a filter. They're not on here, but you can put a filter on here to determine where you want any given resource to go. So you can have up to 8 storehouses because of these 8 belts. And I suppose you could do even more than that, but you're kind of limited based on the number of slots that this thing has, and we're already maxed it out. So if you're willing to sacrifice some, 1 belt for each storehouse instead of 2, you potentially could have 8 belts going in, but having 16 unique resources if you wanted to. Now, it can go the other way. Just because you have 8 belts doesn't mean you need to have 8 resources. You could have 3 of one and 5 of the other. and that would work just fine. Instead of having these 8 storehouses, you'd only have the 2. and have the necessary belts going into them, so the ratio stay the same as far as input belts and output belts. And then after that, you can just have a loader on the other side, or as many as you need, and send them to the bus or wherever they need to go. So how does the logic work? Well, that's where you see all these logic wires. That because this is a fairly large buffer system, every one of these warehouses is connected to the same wire as you see here, even the ones on the train unloading section. This is because that it takes time for this thing to sort through all the resources that comes in. It'll eventually do it, but if you have a lot of trains coming in at once, it's possible that those resources are just going to be sitting in this sorting warehouse, or even the train unloading storehouses, waiting to be processed. And you don't want to send another train just because these warehouses are empty. So as a result, the logistics requests are based on the content of every one of these chests. It considers it one system, because eventually anything that's down here will get to where it needs to go. So there's no point in not considering them as part of the request, because let's say you're using an output of 1 belt per second of your item. Well, if you have 1 belt per second of input, it will make it here at the rate of 1 belt a second. So the system is running smoothly, even if all the resources aren't necessarily concentrated in this one storehouse. So hopefully that makes sense about why all that's connected. And then this is just an LTN train station as anything else. And I was doing some testing earlier. But what you do is select the network. So we want it to be on the coil network, and that's already good to go. It's a requesting station. And some important elements here are the limit of trains is 8, because that's the maximum that this station is designed to handle. So even if there are more available trains, there's no point in sending them because they won't have anywhere to park. So the maximum is 8. So we're going to need to set the output signals based on basically what we want to be in the storehouse. Like, what's the actual desired buffer amount of material? And it's kind of an arbitrary number for you to pick. In this case, it works out pretty well just to make it the size of the train. So for example, let's say you only wanted 1,000 aluminum plates. Well, when you run low, it's going to send an entire train of plates because they fill up. So you're going to basically get 32,000 aluminum plates. But on the LTN manager here, when it shows a train coming by, it'll show a shipment, but the shipment will be like 1,000 aluminum plates, even though it's got 32,000 on board. So it's kind of, it makes reading this kind of weird and not very intuitive if your requests are much smaller than the sizes of the train. So for that reason, I have set the request to be the size of the train. Whether or not those trains are filled, that's another question. But so now we need to request what we want, and the order that they're listed here makes no difference as far as where they end up going up here. So we can just go to our plan and start selecting things. So we need solder coil, copper wire coil, and tin coil. I do kind of want to sort these a little bit. So let's do solder coil, and we'll say the stacks of the train, which is 160, but it has to be negative since this is a requesting station. And it will populate the item amount based on stack size. So we have copper wire coil, negative 160. Tinned, negative 160. Silicon, negative 160. There we go. That is 7 items. So is 7 items the number of items that are being sent by trains? Pretty much. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. At least on that network. If you want a train station to request resources from multiple networks, you can just select all the various networks on here that you want it to request from. So that covers that. But the question is, do we want to send more resources on trains? Because it would be kind of weird to send, say, copper wire coils on a train and it's 28 items per second. And yet we'd be sending 30 insulating boards per second on drones and not trains. That would be kind of weird. Out of all of these items, it looks like insulating boards and carbon definitely make sense to be on trains. Wood, resin, plastic, and iron ore is definitely not going to be on a train because we already have that in the drone network. Those less so, but carbon and insulating boards are a very high volume thing. So we're going to want to send those here as well. We do have train tracks right here. Another thing to consider on if you want to use trains or not is the fact that when you have trains, you have huge buffers of material stuck on the train, and you have to ask yourself, do you really want to have that much stuff? We're talking, hundreds of stacks it ends up being, because you'd have trains with stuff in them, you have warehouses with stuff in them. And the question is, do we want to have that much stuff? Boards are pretty easy to make. We can make them with not that much mineralized water. Making resin might be a bigger deal. Let's see, what does resin go into? Oh, just the phenolic boards, really. Don't really need it for rubber anymore. So this is actually the only application of resin. So despite that it's going to have a large buffer, we do have rails right here. So that might be a better choice than using drones. And the boards as well. Plastic is a little tricky. I mean, we certainly have many trains worth of it sitting in this warehouse. So that's not a problem. It's a little far away from the rail. But it really wouldn't be that big a deal just to run the belt across here and to some stations right here. Now, our wood production is absolutely nowhere near any train stations. That would be kind of a pain to put on a train, so we probably don't need to do that. Plus, its volume is a lot less. I mean, the plastic's volume isn't that high either, but it does go into some random stuff here. So it might be worth having a train for. Really, anytime you can make trains work, you probably should, because they're just better than pretty much any other method of transportation as far as efficiency is concerned. The difficulty with trains is actually setting them up and having room for the train station and all of the tracks. But once you have it set up, it's definitely the ideal way of moving very large amounts of resources around. So right now it's nowhere near wood, so you could probably ignore wood for now. But it is near resin, it is near plastic, and it is near the insulating board, so we can put all of those on there. Then the last question is what to do about the carbon, because we definitely need a ton of carbon. And it's train station adjacent, I suppose. It's not that close, but actually it's a little tricky. But we could continue this rail past this depot and then like come down on the other side, come in, have a train station, and then like go back up and over this depot. I don't really like the sense that it's going to be immediately moved, though, if we expand to more resource types, so that's kind of annoying. I'll just have it in line right here, so lined up right there. And we can make it one space over, like right there. Let's face the wrong direction, though. So we can place it like right here. We need to flip this around, like right there. So we're going to want to have 2 belts of output right here. So we're going to space it up a little bit. We need to make this an LTN train station. And we'll call it carbon load. Let's see. I'm going to do the depot trick from before, where I want the train to park right here, because this is going to be the only train on this network. So the first one, we'll make a third network here. We'll make that carbon. And that's the depot. And the second one is carbon. Provider We don't need to worry about limit trains because there's only going to be one on here. And then provide stack threshold, let's say 1/4 of the train. Or at least 40 stacks. Then let's run a logic wire from the station to all of the inserters. And say their enabled condition has to be a request for carbon. So that way they won't fill the train while it's just sitting here. And actually, to make this work right, probably need to have this be green. Then it needs to go along into each strong box. So that's carbon load, so this one should be carbon devo. So when a request comes in, along the red wire, it will say, I want carbon. So that'll go to each inserter, and then they will turn on and insert the train. This is just to avoid the train having resources on it when it's supposed to be parked at the depot and empty. It's kind of a roundabout way of doing it, but it's very similar to how the acid train was set up. Let's get this hooked up. Actually, I kind of want to stop this for a second, because we are out of oxygen gas on this setup here. So that's the efficient way of making it from pellets. It's weird because it's like it doesn't go anywhere. Oh, it is here. Did it just get moved? It looks like it, and it was never replaced. Well, whoops. There we go, because this is definitely the ideal way of making carbon. Because there's a train station loading off of this, and potentially nuking the system, the priority here probably won't work very well, because if a train comes in and completely sucks up the output of this entire storehouse, then these less ideal methods will be turning on when we really only want to give the ideal way some time. This is probably going to take a long time to fill up, but we probably want to let this fill up to the entire size of a train, which is 32,000. And then this belt should only kick in when things get exceptionally low. Let's just say 16,000, half of the other one. So it's just going to be this running for a while. I kind of want to leave it unhooked and let this run and fill up. Okay, we've got 14,000 carbon on the network here. Yeah, and we place the train, it kind of pops up a little bit. That's okay. We'll get it in the right spot in a bit. Let's see, probably don't need the 10 drones in here anymore. Yeah, we might want to, since fuel blocks are pretty small. So we put some fuel in here. And we can tell it to go to Carbon Depot. And now it's at Carbon Depot. And it's waiting and ready to go. Let's see, we need a request depot here. It's not quite going to fit with the loader. We'll have to do it the old-fashioned way. It's lots of undergrounds. And also a mess of wires. Oh well. That's going to request fuel blocks. We'll put a single drone in there. We need to put some loading stations in here as well. Question is can we fit? I guess we'll need 3 of them. Resin, boards, and plastic in here. In the limited space we've got available. And then basically has like staggered loading stations. Space them a little bit apart. This is getting right up on the bus here, but this bus doesn't even necessarily need to still be here. We could put it somewhere else entirely rather than leaving it here, which might be the smarter option. That would give us a huge amount of space for expanding production here. But the thing about the bus, though, is we go there a lot for parts, so we don't want it to be really far away in the middle of nowhere. So hopefully I don't regret putting these train stations in here. But we shall see. And that's the thing about train stations, is that they take up tons of space. Might be able to save some space. Uh-oh, stuff taking damage again? Yep. Surviving for now. But we might be able to save some space by just integrating the loading station right here in the middle of the tracks. Okay, let's make a combinator to set these as depots. Let's do yet another network. This one we'll call, how about resin? And it's a depot. We'll call it resin depot. Not just resin train, but circuit board train, and the plastic train as well. Okay, we've got to clear all this resin out. And put it in here. And we'll let the resin fill in there. This next one can probably be the circuit boards. So put all the insulating boards in there and get it connected. This last one is plastic, and it's actually coming from the other direction. So we should probably pick it up, flip it around the other way. And this is a job for a belt. What's the best way? Actually, probably just going to the right and going down there. Oh, but I want it to be straight, though. Can it be straight? Yeah, just as long as it has an underground right here. There we go. Okay, all of that should catch up eventually. We gotta wire these up. Might want to consider making some LTN train station patterns here. But let's get this set up. For resin, provider, limit trains. Definitely want to limit the trains to 1, because there's nowhere for them to park. Provide stack threshold of 1/4 of a train. And that should be pretty good. I'm not sure if it'll work if we have all these wires on the same network, because like if we have resin on this wire, a train might park here thinking it has access to resin when it doesn't. So we probably should keep this all separate. We can name this plastic load, insulating board load, and resin load. So insulating board's there, resin's there, plastic load isn't on there yet because it doesn't have 1/4 of a train's worth. So now we need some trains. There we go. Let's see, we need to get some fuel here, and actually having the trains at an angle like this might make this a little hard. So fuel block times 10 drones. Oh wow, we've run out of fuel blocks. Just haven't been processing very many resources. I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We do need something to put into the trains to start the process. Certainly when we start producing more resources, we'll start making a bunch of fuel blocks again. I think we're just out of residual gas. Plus, I bet if we looked at mineralized water, it's basically going to be empty. More or less, yeah. That this output from all of this is actually only if we have an excess of mineralized water. It's not actually designed to run these things normally. But do we need to do it that way? The main thing is the propane gas, because ultimately that's where all this stuff disappears. Yeah, so let's run it based on the state of this tank. And it looks like it resets at 15. So I would say if propane is below 5,000, we should turn it on. So we will follow all of this and come in here. Yeah, that was limited just because the ultimate output of running all of this was essentially to burn the propane, and to an extent burning fuel blocks as well. But we do actually need to have residual gas here, so this will allow it to create a small buffer of propane. Let's see, so instead of mineralized water, it's propane, and it's less than 5,000. It can turn on. Let's see how this works. And it's basically 0 right now, it looks like. Let's make sure it's actually connected. It is. It's just 0. However, because this is so far away from where it's being processed, it might take a long time for the slosh to get up there. They're more or less running at full power. They do stop sometimes, but I mean, that's certainly a lot of processing happening. So this is all running, creating propane, and we actually do need it because now we're consuming a bunch of plastic, so we do need to be filling this up. And when you think of the uses of crushed stone, right now we're basically just holding onto it and then dumping it into a couple of extra resources in the crystallizers. Silicon and silver, basically. And that is reasonably useful, but that's kind of like a last-ditch thing where we have absolutely no use for it in any other location. Then we just turn it into ore. So it's really quite a good idea to be using this to make mineralized water if you need that mineralized water for something. You don't necessarily want to just dump it into mineralized water, but I think this is a better setup because now the fuel blocks are flowing again. And the plastic is flowing too. So let's put some fuel into these trains. Get them all set. And now it's blue. So the trains are ready to go. And resin ran out. Let's find out why. Full on oxygen gas again. Well, when the factory's actually running normally, that shouldn't be a problem. Although we might be able to fix that, because right now we're using a top-up valve just to keep it topped off. So there's not much flex room in that. Let's do a pump here. Let's also make that a bigger tank. Let's set the pump to like 50%. So less than 25,000. Then we need to kind of do a zigzag here. We'll see how that works. So resin should be going again. Yep. Fuel blocks are being delivered. One thing I'm not sure about is why it says the network ID is 8 when that's clearly the 4 slot. Because it's kind of offset in a weird way. I'm not sure why that works that way, but it's network 8. So we hit 8 here. And there's our resources, just about ready to go. So I think this is mostly set up. How's that for an organic LTN setup? Just kind of placed where it could fit. I'm actually kind of proud of that as far as its location here. Now it does take up the end of the track, so no trains can go through here to turn around under normal circumstances. Not that they would though, because it's just the acid train here, which is probably going to get removed when this is set up, so these are really the only trains that would come down here. Same with Rubite's going to get removed too. So it's a little weird having them on the end, but it takes up less space than having room for a train to just go around without touching that. So that actually still leaves room for this bus to expand if it needs to. So it's insulating boards, resin, plastic, and carbon. Iron ore is on the network already. We'll have to send saline water up there. I was thinking we'd do it on site, but that's actually kind of a lot of saline water. But it's also a lot of ferric chloride if we just sent that up as well. I don't know if I want to do a train just for those liquids. That might be just a very, very long pipe. And man, that'd be a huge pipe. Well, there's another solution. We could make saline water by processing mud water, and that would give us mud as a result. But sending mud on a drone would be quite easy because it doesn't make much mud compared to the amount of water that goes into it. So that's probably the better option here. So let's actually calculate that on this list, where it's saline water in the washing plant, then the thin mud water, the light mud water, concentrated mud water, and the heavy mud water, and finally the viscous, which I think that should be the one, comes in on a pump. There we go. So if we did it this way, we would have an input of 3.8 iron ore, which is something drones could easily do. Water, which is readily available. We'd have an output of sodium hydroxide, which is valuable and that's very slow, so drones can do that. Same with mud. The only thing that would be left over is hydrogen gas, and then the question is, do we really want to send hydrogen gas on a drone or even a train because it's kind of a really low value byproduct? Or do we just burn it to make it go away the easy way? That sounds like the better option, rather than trying to save every last bit of hydrogen. But we'll see, that's actually an amount that a drone could potentially do. So we'll have to see how that works. Out of all this stuff, I think the only thing that isn't on a drone yet is the wood. Or is it? Actually, it does. Looks like there is a supply depot here already. It's kind of in a weird spot, but we have a supply depot. And wood is on the network, so actually, that's pretty good. So I think we can go back to setting up that train station. Okay, we have one more request to add here. We've got 4 more things on the LTN network, but we only have 8 slots for this particular train station. So we'll just request, let's say, the carbon, and that looks pretty good. So the last thing that needs to get set up is the stack threshold. In other words, how low do the resources need to get before it sends a second train? And I have this set to 70. Basically, the ultimate limiting factor on how many resources can fit here is the storehouse. So if a train normally holds 160, we actually can't fit 2 trains here because that would be 320. So if a train holds 160 stacks and we let this get short by 70 stacks, that would leave 90 stacks left. So 90 plus 160 is 250, and that's more or less the capacity. So you kind of have to do that math in your head. If we are short 70 stacks, it means there's still 90 in there. So that's kind of the thought process of how that works. Well, I think we're at that time where we can turn this on and see what happens. That if it works correctly, when we turn it on, a bunch of requests that happen all at the same time, and then all these trains will immediately start moving and getting loaded. And then they'll all wait and get loaded, but once they are loaded, they'll come flying down, rush in here. One train will get in here first and start getting unloaded. Then the rest of them will pile in and wait their turn. So let's see how this works. Ah yes, we need to set the network ID to include the carbon as well. We don't need to worry about the resin because it's not requesting anything from those particular stations. Alright, we've got it mostly set up, but we have one other consideration to do. And that's actually in the LTN settings. Luckily they're map settings, so we can just change them right now. But specifically, we need to look at the stop timeout and then the delivery timeout. The stop timeout is how long can a train sit in a loading or unloading station getting loaded or unloaded before it must leave. Like how long can that time period be? And personally, I'm fine with that being forever. if the train is stuck in the station because it couldn't unload its materials, that means something got set wrong. So I'd probably prefer to find out rather than just have trains leaving half full. And you can deactivate this with a 0. So we can set that to 0 because a lot of these stations actually take a decent amount of time to load because they only have a few inserters. Specifically just because the production rate for those resources isn't very fast. So the inserters aren't very fast either because they don't need to be. So our stations, there's a lot of stations that'll take longer than 120 seconds to load. So we want that off. Now, unfortunately, we can't do the same for a delivery timeout. But basically, this is kind of the same thing, except for the train's delivery as a whole. Like, how long can it take to do the whole thing before LTN decides, something went wrong here, and it just sends the train back to the depot? And that's never good. And 10 minutes actually isn't that long when you consider that it's going to take a few minutes to load the train, and then when we turn on this station, there's going to be a bunch of trains waiting in line to get in here. So those trains, they might be there for longer than 10 minutes. So I'm also fine with the idea that a network has some slosh to it, let's say, like a fluid pipe, and it takes time for things to happen. They don't happen instantly. So 10 minutes is actually too short a period of time. So I'm going to increase that to 100 minutes. Basically disabling this feature. I'm perfectly fine with trains being stuck in line because if trains are stuck in line, we can see that and then determine a fix if we need to. So that should be basically everything. And that's the end of this episode. On the next one, we are going to flip the switch and see how all this works. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.